Imagine the unthinkable, a quiet night, a child hiding in fear, and a deadly figure lurking just steps away. A life is taken in cold blood, and the killer is closer than anyone could ever imagine. What happens when hope fades, but survival sparks a flicker of defiance? Stay with us as we unravel a chilling tale of fear, betrayal, and the unbreakable will to survive. This is the story you won't forget. Watch till the end to discover the shocking truth. For Minnie, the night was thick with silence. In a small suburban house, the ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound. A soft, distant hum of the refrigerator, the only other presence. Inside the bedroom, the air felt heavy. The room was dark, only a sliver of moonlight slipping through the window. The bed, neatly made earlier, was now in disarray. Her body lay there, still, lifeless. A shadowy figure stood over her, a cold gleam in their eyes. The bedroom door creaked open slowly. A child stood just outside, eyes wide, heart pounding. They had heard something. A faint, chilling sound. A whisper of movement from within. The child's small hand reached for the doorframe, shaking. In the next room, the television still buzzed quietly. An innocuous distraction. But the child's focus was on the doorway, on the distant sound of their mother's voice. But now it was different. Her voice had stopped. The figure moved again. It was a soft scrape of shoes against the hardwood floor. A gentle push of breath. The child's chest tightened. They could feel it, the fear. It hung in the air like a suffocating fog. The moonlight flickered. It revealed something in the shadows. A hint of movement. A glint of metal. A flash of red. The child's hand trembled. The silence now felt deafening. Suddenly, the house felt too small, too quiet, too still. The child swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed to run, to leave the door. But they stood frozen, too afraid to move, too afraid to make a sound. The figure loomed over the body, their movements deliberate. Each step calculated, like a predator. The child felt the hairs on their neck stand up. The air shifted, a sense of something terrible happening. It was as if time itself had slowed. The room, dark and still, held secrets no one should know. The weight of the moment pressed down on them. The child wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. Only the heavy beating of their heart. A whisper, a click, then footsteps. The child's heart raced. A chill ran down their spine. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The child felt their breath catch in their throat. The figure was coming toward the door, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the child's ears. The silence before it felt endless. Too long, too quiet. Then, a sharp gasp from the bedroom. A soft, unsettling sound. The figure stopped just beyond the door. The child held their breath, praying not to be seen. The air thickened with a scent of fear. A distant hum from the fridge was the only sound again. Suddenly, the bedroom light flickered on. For a moment, the figure stood still, almost as if waiting, watching. The child's heart thundered in their chest. A sharp sound, the scrape of metal against wood. A flash of light, bright, blinding. The figure had a weapon in hand. A knife. The child's stomach churned. Their mind screamed to move, to escape. But they were frozen, trapped in the darkness, with no way to run. The figure moved once more, stepping closer to the lifeless body on the bed. The bed, now stained with crimson. The child could see the faint outline of their mother, her body contorted unnaturally. The smell of death lingered. A sickening, metallic scent that filled the room. The figure loomed over the body, a twisted smile on their face. The child's hand clenched into a fist. Their eyes never left the figure, their entire body trembling. The house felt like a prison, the walls closing in, suffocating. The moments stretched into eternity. And then nothing. A soft shuffle of feet. The figure was moving away, back into the shadows. The child remained still, too afraid to even breathe. In the silence that followed, the room seemed to freeze. The air was thick with tension. The child, trembling, stared at the darkened doorway. But the horror wasn't over. It had just begun. The child waited, every muscle locked in place, unwilling to move. The silence felt like it would suffocate them. But then footsteps again. Soft, steady, and getting closer. The child's pulse raced as they instinctively took a step back. Their small hand brushed the wall, a quiet sound, but enough to break the stillness. The footsteps stopped. Everything froze. The child's heart skipped a beat. Then, the figure appeared in the doorway. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the figure's face, but it was enough. The eyes were cold, empty. The child didn't know whether to run or stay. A cruel smile twisted the figure's lips. The air grew colder. Frost seemed to form on the edges of the doorframe. The child's breath became shallow, each heartbeat pounding in their ears. The figure stepped forward, closer, but said nothing. Not a word. Just the sound of their footsteps getting nearer. A strange noise, a soft dragging sound. The child's gaze flickered to the floor, noticing something glinting in the dim light. A small object. A keychain, perhaps. Their mother's. The cold realization hit them like a punch to the stomach. This was real. This was happening. The figure moved closer still, the space between them narrowing. The child's body screamed to flee, but their legs wouldn't cooperate. The room was suffocating, the air too thick. A whisper, too quiet to understand. The figure leaned down. Closer. Closer. The child's breath hitched, barely audible. It felt like time had stopped. Then, without a word, the figure moved past them. The child could smell the faint trace of blood in the air. The figure didn't stop. They walked toward the stairs, every step echoing, each one louder than the last. And in that moment, the child knew. It wasn't over. It was far from over. The figure was coming back. But what would happen next? The child's heart raced, a frantic drumbeat in their chest. They pressed themselves against the wall, hoping to disappear into the shadows. The figure was moving slowly, methodically, down the hall. Each step deliberate. Each breath shallow. The air felt thick with dread. The child's eyes darted to the bedroom door, still ajar. The body of their mother was no longer visible, swallowed by the darkness. But the smell, the metallic tang of blood, lingered in the air. The child swallowed hard, their throat tight. The figure was almost at the stairs now. A faint creak echoed through the floorboards. The child could hear it, every breath, every shift of weight. Then a soft sound. A faint scrape on the wood. The child's eyes widened. The figure had paused, as if sensing something. As if they had heard the child's heartbeat. The seconds dragged on, excruciatingly slow. Then the figure turned. Without warning. The cold, lifeless eyes locked with the child's. Time seemed to stretch in that instant. The figure didn't speak. They didn't move. It was as if the world had stopped, and only the two of them existed in that moment. The child's breath hitched, and without thinking, they bolted. They ran. Out of the hallway, past the darkened doorway, toward the front door. But as they reached it, too late. The figure had already closed the distance. A hand, cold and strong, grabbed their wrist. The child screamed, but no sound escaped their lips. Just the pressure, the suffocating grip. The figure's voice was low, like a growl. "Don't make a sound." The child froze, paralyzed with terror. The world seemed to blur around them. Every escape route blocked. The figure dragged them back toward the bedroom, back toward the nightmare. The child's legs kicked out, but it was useless. The figure's strength was overpowering. And then, the final realization hit them. The nightmare wasn't just happening. It was their nightmare now. Forever. The bedroom door creaked open again. The child was shoved inside, the world spinning. The air felt heavier than before, thicker with dread. The light from the hallway barely illuminated the room, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The child's legs buckled, and they fell to their knees, gasping for breath. Tears blurred their vision, but they couldn't stop them. The figure stood over them, silent, unmoving. The weight of the presence was crushing. The room felt impossibly small. The child's mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare, of the cruelty unfolding. But there was nothing, no way to fight back. No one to help. The figure crouched down, its eyes still cold, merciless. "Don't think you can escape," the voice whispered, low and sinister. The child shuddered, a chill crawling up their spine.
The blood.
The smell. The darkness. It all felt too real, too suffocating. The figure's hand reached for something in its coat. The child's pulse quickened, eyes darting to the window. Could they escape? But it was too late. The figure had already seen the fear in their eyes. With a flick of the wrist, a small object was tossed onto the floor, a set of keys, their mother's keys. The child's breath caught. It was a cruel reminder, a sharp stab of reality. They were trapped. No way out. The figure smirked, standing back up. Without another word, it turned away, and the child was left there, trembling, alone in the dark. But the worst part was yet to come. The house felt like a tomb, and the silence was deafening. The door closed with a soft thud. The child was left in the shadows, surrounded by memories of a life that was now lost. And then, the final cold realization. No one would ever hear their screams. The room was suffocating in its stillness. The child remained on the floor, paralyzed by fear. The silence now felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. The seconds dragged by, each one longer than the last. The faint glow of the moon illuminated the edges of the window, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. A cold breeze stirred the air, making the child shiver, but it wasn't the chill that froze them to the spot. It was the overwhelming sense of helplessness. Every sound, every movement outside the room, felt distant. The house felt so empty, so hollow. And then, from behind the door, a voice echoed in the stillness. It was almost a whisper, a mocking whisper. "You should have stayed hidden." The child's blood ran cold, their heart pounding so loudly in their chest they feared it would betray them. The figure was still out there, watching, waiting, and they knew there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The house had become a trap. The child squeezed their eyes shut, desperately trying to block out the terrifying reality. But no matter how hard they tried, the images came rushing back. The flash of metal, the cold eyes, the scent of blood, and then the memory of the mother's lifeless body. It was too much, too real. Tears filled their eyes, streaming down their cheeks. But no comfort came. The silence stretched again, almost suffocating. And then, just when it seemed like the world had stopped spinning, the door creaked open once more. The figure appeared in the doorway again, moving slowly, deliberately. This time, there was no smile, no mockery, just the cold, emotionless gaze of someone who had already decided their fate. The child's body tensed. They tried to move, but the fear held them in place like a vice. The figure stepped closer, each movement calculated, precise. And for the first time, the child realized something chilling. This wasn't just about fear. It was about control. The figure was in control. And they weren't going to stop. Not until the child was completely broken. The figure moved even closer, and the air grew colder, thick with dread. The child's breath caught in their throat as they instinctively shrank back, pressing themselves into the corner of the room. But there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in. The figure's presence was suffocating, filling the room with an oppressive weight. The child's eyes flickered to the window, desperate for any sign of hope, but it was too late. The darkness outside offered no escape. The figure stood over them, towering like a shadow, its face hidden in the dim light. The The silence was unbearable now, stretching for what felt like an eternity. With a slow, deliberate motion, the figure reached into their coat and pulled out something small, an object glinting in the moonlight. The child's mind raced. What was it? A knife? A weapon? But then, the figure tossed it onto the floor with a soft clink. It was the child's favorite toy, a small, worn-out stuffed bear. The figure's voice came low, almost mocking. You thought this would protect you? This thing. The child's heart shattered at the sight of it.
The bear.
It had been their mother's last gift, a small piece of comfort in the darkness. Tears streamed down the child's face as the figure's cruel laughter echoed through the room. It felt like everything was slipping away. The figure knelt down slowly, bringing their face close to the child's. There was no warmth, no empathy, just cold, empty eyes. Your mother couldn't protect you, the figure whispered, almost tenderly. And now neither can you. The words struck like a physical blow. The child's chest tightened, and their breath became shallow. A suffocating panic surged within them. The figure's hand reached out, slowly, deliberately, but before it could touch them, a sound shattered the stillness. A distant, faint sound. Footsteps outside. The figure froze. The child's eyes widened, their pulse quickening. Could it be? Could someone else be here? But the figure's gaze shifted, locking onto the child's with a chilling, knowing look. No one is coming, the figure said softly. Not this time. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The child's hopes dashed against the hard reality. The figure's hand tightened around their wrist. And then, without another word, the door slammed shut. The house fell silent again. The silence that followed was suffocating. The child's heart pounded in their chest, every beat a deafening echo in the stillness. The footsteps outside had stopped, and with them, any hope the child had clung to. They were alone again.
Trapped.
The figure's hand still gripped their wrist, cold and unyielding. The pressure was relentless, as if the figure was testing the child's resolve, their ability to withstand the fear, the pain, the terror. But there was no escape, no release. The child's body trembled, unable to stop the shaking. Their vision blurred with tears, but still, they couldn't move. The figure stood there unmoving, as if waiting for something. Perhaps, for the final moment, for the breaking point. The air around them felt heavier than before. The room, once so familiar, now felt like a prison, a dark, suffocating cell. And then the figure spoke again, their voice barely a whisper. Do you understand now? They asked. Do you understand what's happened? The child didn't answer. They couldn't. The truth was too terrible, too final. The figure's grip loosened for just a moment, as if allowing the child a glimpse of hope. But it was fleeting. The figure leaned in closer, their breath cold against the child's skin. You're not leaving this place, the figure murmured, their voice almost soothing, as if they were comforting the child in their final moments. The words struck with a cruel clarity. The house felt even smaller now, like the walls were closing in, suffocating the child with each passing second. The figure straightened up, taking a step back. The silence grew again, heavier than before. The child's breath caught, barely a whisper against the suffocating air. But then, something unexpected happened. A faint sound. A knock. The child's eyes shot to the door, desperate. Could it be someone? Could someone be outside? The figure didn't move. They didn't even flinch. But the child's hope flared. Just for a second. But it was enough. The knock came again, louder this time. The child's pulse raced, heart hammering in their chest. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe someone had heard. But the figure was still motionless, their cold eyes never leaving the child. And then, the door creaked open. The door creaked open slowly, the sound scraping against the silence like nails on a chalkboard. A sliver of light cut through the darkened room, spilling across the floor, casting long shadows. The figure didn't move. The child held their breath, staring at the doorway, their heart pounding in their chest.
Who was it?
Was it someone who could save them? The faintest movement caught the child's eye, just a shift in the figure's posture. The figure was watching, waiting. Then, a voice, soft but clear, broke through the tension. "Hello? Is anyone in here?" It was a man's voice. The child's hope surged. Could it be? The figure's face darkened, eyes narrowing. A moment of stillness passed. Then, without warning, the figure stepped away from the child, their hand releasing its grip on the wrist. The child, dazed and confused, couldn't fully comprehend what was happening. The door was still open, just a crack. The man's voice called again, louder this time. "Is everything okay in there? I heard something." The figure didn't answer. Instead, they stepped toward the window, their movements deliberate, almost cautious. The child, still in a daze, shifted, barely able to breathe. Their eyes locked onto the man in the doorway. He was standing just outside, peering into the darkened room, confusion etched across his face. The figure, now standing motionless by the window, seemed to be deciding something. The man hesitated for a moment, then stepped further inside. "Hello," he called again, more forcefully this time. "What's going on? Who's in here?" The child's breath caught. Could this stranger help them? Could this be the escape they so desperately needed? But the figure, with an unsettling calm, suddenly moved. They turned quickly, too quickly. The man froze, eyes widening, realizing the danger too late. The figure was on him in an instant, their movements fluid, predatory. A flash of movement, a struggle. Then, a sickening thud. The man collapsed to the ground, blood pooling around him, his last breath caught in a soft, final gasp. The child gasped, choking on their own fear. The figure stood over the man's body, their face expressionless. The child, heart racing, could barely comprehend what had just happened. The figure turned slowly, locking eyes with the child. There was no relief, no rescue, only the cold, unblinking gaze of someone who had just silenced yet another witness. And then, the figure's voice, calm as ever, broke the silence. "You thought you could be saved." The words were like a dagger. "There's no one coming for you," the figure continued, a cruel twist to their lips. The door creaked shut behind them, and the house was silent once again. The child was alone. The room felt darker now, as if the very walls were swallowing the light. The child sat frozen, unable to move, their breath shallow, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The figure's shadow lingered in the corner, but the child couldn't look away from the body on the floor. The man, whose voice had been a fleeting hope, was now nothing more than another lifeless form in the nightmare. The child's stomach churned, a wave of nausea rising within them. The silence that followed felt suffocating, unbearable. The sound of their own pulse thumping in their ears was the only thing keeping them tethered to the moment. The figure, unmoved, watched from across the room, a still and silent observer. The child dared not look at them directly. They feared that even a glance would trigger something worse. Seconds dragged into minutes, and the house seemed to hold its breath. The door, now fully closed, felt like a tomb. The air had grown thick and oppressive. The child's hands clenched into fists, but even that small action was enough to make them wince. It felt like their entire body had become a raw nerve. The figure didn't approach. They merely stood there, watching the child, a constant reminder of the horror they had unleashed. Then, without any warning, the figure spoke again. "Why do you still think you have a choice?" The words were quiet, casual, as if this was a game they had already won. The child wanted to scream, to fight back, but the terror inside them was too overwhelming. There was no fight left. Only survival. Only instinct. The figure moved, slow and deliberate, crossing the room toward the door. And, in that moment, the child knew. They weren't meant to be saved. This was their fate now. The figure reached the door, and just before exiting, they turned once more. "You'll learn soon enough," they said, their voice colder than the air around them. The child's breath hitched, but they didn't speak.
Couldn't speak.
The figure stepped into the hallway, closing the door softly behind them. And once again, the house fell into an agonizing stillness. The house was silent.
Still.
The child sat in the corner, the darkness pressing against them like a weight. The dim light from the hallway barely filtered through the cracks in the door, casting just enough light to show the chaos in the room, the body on the floor, the blood that had already begun to dry, the torn pieces of their life scattered around. Time seemed to stand still. The child's mind spun in a blur. Thoughts jumbled, questions unanswered. They couldn't understand it, couldn't grasp the reality of what was happening. The figure had left, but the terror hadn't. It clung to every inch of the room, every corner, every breath. The child's hands trembled. Their legs felt numb. Their body felt like it wasn't even theirs anymore. The faintest noise from the hallway caught their attention, a distant creak, the sound of something shifting. Their eyes snapped to the door, fear surging once more. But no one entered. Only silence. It felt like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to come. But there was no sound, no movement. The child's chest tightened with panic, the walls closing in. Was it over? Was the nightmare finished, or was something worse coming? The figure hadn't killed them. Not yet. But the cruelty in their eyes made it clear. They could end this at any moment. The thought alone was enough to make the child shiver. A soft breath escaped their lips, a small, involuntary noise that seemed to break the stillness. And then, the door cracked open again. This time, the child didn't dare look up. They couldn't. They couldn't risk seeing that cold, lifeless gaze again. The door creaked wider, but no footsteps followed. It was the faintest shift in the air. The smell of blood was overpowering now. The air was thicker, heavier. And still, no sound. No movement. The child's heartbeat quickened. They felt trapped. Completely alone. But there was nothing more to do but wait. Wait for the figure to return. Wait for the end. The air in the room felt like it had solidified, each breath an effort, each moment stretching endlessly. The door was ajar now, a sliver of the hallway's dim light creeping in, casting unsettling shadows across the room. The silence was broken only by the faint sound of the child's own breathing, shallow and ragged. But there was something else. Something waiting. The child's eyes flicked from the door to the body on the floor, then back to the doorway. Every instinct screamed to run, to move, but the child remained frozen. The terror was paralyzing. And then, just as the stillness reached its breaking point, a voice cut through it.
Soft.
Unseen. "Do you want to know why?" The figure was back. The child's blood ran cold, their whole body tightening with fear. They hadn't heard the footsteps. There had been no warning, no sound, just the voice, speaking in that low, chilling tone that made everything else feel unreal. "Do you want to know why your mother couldn't save you?" The voice was closer now, but the figure remained hidden in the shadows. The child's throat was dry. They couldn't answer, couldn't find words. The voice continued, colder, more detached. "It's simple, really. She was weak. She couldn't protect you because she was too busy protecting herself." The words echoed through the child's mind, each one landing with a heavy thud. "You thought you could escape," the figure whispered, now right behind the child. "But there's no escape from what's already been set in motion." The child flinched, but still, they couldn't move. "Fear is a prison. And you, my dear, are its prisoner." The figure's breath was cold against the child's ear, sending a shiver down their spine. "Now, you will learn what true helplessness feels like." The child's pulse thundered in their ears as they finally summoned the strength to look up. The figure's face was a blur, just a dark shape in the dim light, but the coldness of their presence was undeniable. And in that moment, the child realized the worst truth of all. The figure wasn't just here to kill them. They were here to break them, to destroy everything inside them. The child's mind screamed for escape, for a way out, but all they could do was sit there, consumed by terror, as the figure stepped forward, closer still, their cold eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. And as the figure closed the distance, the child could feel the final moments of their life slipping away. The figure stood over the child, their shadow casting long and menacing across the room. The air was thick with tension, almost suffocating in its intensity. The child's body trembled, but their mind was spinning. Too fast, too much to process. The figure's cold eyes glinted in the dim light, the cruel satisfaction they had spoken of now hanging like a dark cloud, ready to crush any last remnants of hope. The child's pulse thundered in their ears, the world feeling unreal, as if the nightmare had merged with reality, leaving no escape. But then, something unexpected happened. The figure stopped, hovering in place, as though caught by a sudden thought. The child's mind raced, wondering if this was some twisted game, some cruel torment that the figure was playing. For a moment, everything was still again. The only sound was the child's shallow breathing, each exhale an effort, each second stretched in excruciating slowness. And then, the figure's voice broke the silence once more. "Fear," they whispered. "Fear is the most powerful weapon." The words lingered in the room, heavy with meaning. The child's mind reeled, unable to grasp the significance. They wanted to scream, to lash out, but their body was still frozen in place. The figure's gaze softened, if only slightly, as they studied the child. "You're not weak," they said, almost as if surprised. "You've been stronger than you know." The words were like a shock to the system, shaking the child from their paralyzing fear. The figure had spoken as though they saw something inside them, something the child hadn't seen, or maybe just hadn't believed. For the first time, the child didn't feel entirely helpless. The figure took a step back, their presence still looming, but there was a pause. A moment where the child felt something shift. "Live," the figure murmured, their voice quieter now, almost gentle. "Survive. You will find your way out." And with that, the figure turned, their footsteps fading into the hallway. The door remained ajar, but this time, the light outside seemed less suffocating. The child, still shaken, finally drew in a shaky breath, the weight of everything threatening to pull them under. But deep down something stirred. The darkness wasn't all-encompassing. For the first time, the child felt like they could move. And they did, slowly, trembling but alive. There was still hope. There was still a chance to survive. The child stood motionless in the corner, their entire body frozen with exhaustion and fear. The room around them was still, eerily quiet, but the faint light from the hallway offered a glimmer of something they hadn't felt in what felt like forever. Hope. The figure's words lingered in the air, a chilling yet oddly comforting promise. "You will find your way out." The child's mind was reeling, but now, amidst the suffocating silence, the weight of those words began to settle into their heart. For the first time, the overwhelming fear loosened its grip, if only a little. The child took a tentative step forward, then another. Their legs felt heavy, as if the weight of their terror had left them too weak to move. But still they pushed on one step at a time. The hallway beyond the door was empty now, but the promise of escape was clear. The child wasn't sure what had happened, what had caused the figure to step back, to allow them this moment of freedom. Perhaps it was all part of some twisted game, some sick psychological torment. Or perhaps the figure truly believed the child could survive. Either way, they couldn't waste it. The child's breath quickened as they stepped into the hallway, their pulse still racing, but a spark of determination began to burn through the fear. They weren't going to let this be the end.
Not now.
Not when they had a chance to fight for their life. Every creak of the floorboards beneath them made their heart skip a beat. The house was still alive with its dark presence, but it wasn't invincible. The child had survived this far. They would keep going. They would find a way out. With each step they took, they felt a growing strength inside themselves, something that had been buried under the weight of fear for so long. They had been broken, shattered, but now they were beginning to rebuild. And as the child reached the door at the end of the hallway, they paused, just for a moment. Outside, the night air felt fresh, almost new. The child stepped into the world beyond, leaving the house and the nightmare behind. For the first time in what seemed like forever, they were free. And though the memories of what had happened would never truly fade, the child knew this. They had survived.